So by simplifying the world for ourselves, we are actually removing a lot of the nutrition. And to go back to the meaning thing, there's that paradox that comfort is not necessarily something we want to get rid of, right? It's like if you have children, you don't want to go back to a world where 50% of them are going to die. At the same time, hardship gives life meaning. How do we square that?
I'm delighted to welcome today Mr. Rafe Kelley, the founder of Evolve, Move and Play, martial artist, parkour expert, wisdom seeker, and a very interesting guy. So thanks for joining me today, Rafe. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, likewise. It's a pleasure to join you.
And I thought the first thing to start off with, I suppose, I wanted to get your kind of framing of the meaning crisis and then how you see that dovetailing, I suppose, with Evolve, Move, Play and with your project there. Do you see it as a solution to it? Do you see it as a solution to an aspect of it? I thought that might be a place for us to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many different ecologies of practices that are developing. Uh, and so, I don't think that we're necessarily the complete solution, but I do think that there's perhaps something especially fundamental about what we're doing, because I don't think anything else has really evolved bottoms up from movement practices in the same way. And yeah, I believe that that's actually fundamental, that the biggest driver of the meaning crisis is this Cartesian duality of mind and body and the capture of our minds within a machine paradigm. So I can break all that down a little bit more. The machine paradigm part is something I'm thinking a lot about right now, and it's difficult to fully articulate. But to back up a little bit, you know, I imagine, I'm not sure exactly what your audience is, but I imagine most of them are familiar with John Vervaeke's work. And John's really laid out the case for the meaning crisis that we have. It's such an interesting world to live in, because paradoxically, you could easily make a case that we live in the best time to live in human history, right? Never been a time when you are more likely to have sufficient food, sufficient clean water, sufficient warmth, right? Heat, energy, um, less likely to, you know, die of diarrhea or, the cold or the flu. Never been less likely to be murdered, raped, assaulted, have your stuff taken. People really have a excessively romantic idea about the past. I was just reading about press gangs, right? Like, pirates would just come by and take you and say, "Hey, you're a pirate now. There's nothing you can do about it. You gotta get on the oars." And we don't have to worry about that kind of thing at all. And so you'd think, "Oh, this is great. Like, I've got 3 children. I'm not worried that they're going to die because of mumps or measles or any number of things." And that's not really been the case. Even, people talk a lot about the hunter-forager past as this exceptionally idyllic moment in human history. And there's aspects of that that are true. Hunter-foragers probably do, a lot of them work maybe a little bit less than we do, and they have relatively less like excesses of power, and they tend to have a very intense meaning system, like their lives feel really meaningful. But on the other hand, the rates of endemic violence in hunter-forager societies are worse than the most violent cities that we have in the modern world. Like, if you average it across cultures, it's like 10 to 60% of men can expect to be murdered or killed in warfare in most pre-state societies. And the objection to that people would make is, well, we're looking at societies that are on the margin, that have been pushed out by state level societies. But even when we look at the archaeological record, we still see 10, 15% of men who have visible wounds associated with their death. So 10 to 15% are, have a spear wound or have their skull cracked. It's likely even higher that we don't, we're not just seeing the evidence of what killed them. So the law. So yeah. So first of all, we should feel blessed to live when we do in some ways. And then at the same time, we have rising epidemics of anxiety and depression and meaninglessness and disconnection from our bodies, right? The obesity crisis, I think, can be seen as a kind of loss of integrity in the body, right? And people don't realize it, but
at the same time that we have an obesity crisis, we have a lack of muscular development, a lack of physical development. We're weaker than we've ever been. And this is showing up in, inability to have children, right? Fertility is a huge crisis. And the sense that life is surreal, that there's no meaning to it, that there's nothing that we're oriented towards is really out there. And it's probably upstream of depression and anxiety rather than downstream. And we know this because people will commit suicide even if they're not sad. Um, and then the last point on this is, well, sorry, I lost my last point, but it just goes on and on, right? You can look at something like friendship and see that I think it's like 15% of people no longer can say they have even one close friend. And so we have a crisis of meaning in our culture. I think it's playing out in the extreme polarization that we see. There's a kind of, for me at least, it feels like the political sides are both being driven towards madness. There are elements of either political coalition that I can't see as anything other than people just completely losing touch with reality and becoming so attached to the alienation they have from the other ideology, that anything that alienates the other ideology becomes support. So that's my understanding of the meaning crisis. Does that all land for you?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's an interesting place to start as well in terms of having gratitude for the position that we're in, as well as sort of taking the existential angst seriously. And I 100% agree with you that the romanticization of the past is deeply misguided. I've been reading a lot of Irish history lately, and the entire thing is just an absolute nightmare. It's really just mainly people just being murdered by the British and pillaged, and it wasn't great. Like,
they murder each other lots.
well, that too, yeah. I mean, I shouldn't throw the British under the bus, but yeah,
Well,
that.
As you know, my last
Sorry.
name is the
I was thinking
it's the second
might
most
have
common
some
one,
ancestry.
I believe. So when I was in my early teens, I had this whole like Irish American, rah thing, and it was actually a way of escaping the like white guilt that I had growing up as a as a member of the counterculture and on the left, right? There was this whole thing about like certain, like literally you can actually see it in the data in I think it's in the late 1980s. The number of people who report English as their primary ancestry in the States just drops off a cliff. Like,
No way.
it's like a half reduction in people who are reported as their common ancestry. Everyone starts identifying as something other than English.
Whatever they can grasp onto.
There's this
Any
whole Celtic Renaissance that happened then, where Celtic music becomes really popular. There's fairs and there's this Celtic mysticism that goes through the like where in the 1970s it was all about Native American mysticism and Eastern mysticism. Like Celtic mysticism gets picked up and promoted big time around that time. So I was part of that. It turns out my last Irish ancestor immigrated in 1720 and married into New England Puritans, and then it's all New England Puritans down the line.
Well, you can still count. But
I've got an Irish Y chromosome, but that's about it.
But also, I mean, that makes sense in terms of this idea of the loss of. I love the Vervaeke talks about the sacred canopy. I can't remember who wrote the book initially, but this loss of the kind of meaning structure that was somewhat built into the environment when you had this kind of scarcity and these immediate challenges. Like you had opposition right in front of you, you had needs that were in front of you. It was, in a sense, much more aggressive and violent and difficult, but also much more immediate and more graspable in a sense. Now, I think because we've been kind of sucked out of the realm of nature a little bit, people are kind of it's a much murkier territory. I mean, we have these problems like obesity and self-destruction and alienation, and the existential issues they're much more, I suppose, nuanced in a sense that they're within yourself, that this fight is going on, as opposed to a fight with nature or with society or with, I suppose it does come out in those areas. But do you see that? Because it seems like a lot of your work is about returning to nature in that sense as well. Do you think that that's kind of a bottom up approach to develop that kind of agent arena relationship again?
I mean, in a very fundamental way, nature is the arena, right? Like
Mm.
we can isolate and simplify nature down, which is basically what we're doing in cities, right? Cities are nature made less objectionable to human beings in a way. And there's some downside cost to that, right? If you pave the road, it becomes a lot easier to walk. The energy cost of getting from one point to another is lower um, before you even add vehicles. Uh, but there's less nutrition for your body, right? So if you move through a traditional environment, like if you're, say, a hunter forager or horticulturalist in Papua New Guinea, where you have these very steep slopes filled with fallen logs and rocks and vines, it's like you become very agile because you have to be. You have to be strong to move up and down through these environments. You have to access the whole panoply of uh, of human locomotor capacities. But then come to the city and you can just walk everywhere. And it turns out that your shoulder, for instance, can start developing an impingement just because you don't have enough time hanging from things. So by simplifying the world for ourselves, we are actually removing a lot of the nutrition. And to go back to the meaning thing, there's that paradox that comfort is not necessarily something we want to get rid of, right? It's like if you have children, you don't want to go back to a world where 50% of them are going to die. And at the same time, hardship gives life meaning. How do we square that? I really like the work of, I shouldn't say that because I haven't read his work as deeply as I like, but I like a few things that I've seen from Sebastian Jung that really rang for me. He was a journalist who worked in Afghanistan during the Afghanistan war. And he wrote a couple different books on it, but he wrote a book called Tribe, and he was interviewed on Joe Rogan. And he said something that really struck with me. He said that what human beings like best is being part of a small group struggling to survive. There's a key piece that I missed there. He said, human beings like being an integral part of a small group struggling to survive. And we like that. We're rewarded by that because if we weren't, we wouldn't have survived. That was the default condition throughout human history until very, very recently. And so it fires our meaning-making kind of neurology in the brain when we're doing that. And that's essentially what we have done with our retreats without really recognizing it, is we've created an environment in which each individual becomes very relevant and salient to all the other individuals. They all experience some kind of positive struggle and they have triumph and they bond through it. And then they have this experience of deep, meaningful intimacy. So I want to tell you the story. Like took a group of friends canyoneering recently. So canyoneering is kind of scary, right? Like we drop into this canyon and we descend on ropes into a canyon, and then we're hiking down it and having to descend on ropes repeatedly and having to jump down into water and jump from rock to rock to rock. And to get from the top of the canyon to the bottom of the canyon is 9 hours. So one of the people who came with me, he slipped on a jump and cracked his chin open and had a bleeding open chin right from the start. And then another one was a young woman who has struggled a lot with fear, and she fell repeatedly because she was too afraid to she was overreacting to everything and falling down. So and then another guy who came, he had injured his foot from overtraining just 2 weeks before. And so he was limping for 9, down this canyon. And when you work with groups and you've done this for a long time, you kind of get a sense for when a group is in a group flow state and it feels really good. And then you get a sense when people are struggling and it's not fun and they're just kind of miserable. And for the first hour and a half we were in the canyon, it was I don't know if this group was ready for this level of challenge. And people are looking scared. They're looking hesitant. They're looking what have I gotten myself into? Right. And then at a certain point, you could start to feel it shift. And then everybody's really like, it's still scary. It's still hard, but like people have accepted how challenging it is. And they're able to kind of see through the challenge and enjoy how unique the experience is, being surrounded by these huge, beautiful waterfalls just pouring down. And, feeling your body, feeling the work that you're doing, pushing, 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 right? And it's like your mind kind of gets shut down because it just you can't think a lot. Like all that other stuff has to go away. The stuff that preoccupies you in your day to day. So we get to the end and everyone's really happy. And then they start sending me like stories about their experience. It's like, this is one of the most profound experiences I've had in my entire life. It's like coolest thing. Wow. It's so interesting to see that because I remember how uncomfortable the challenge was for a lot of people in the beginning, to the point where I was like, I might have to like pull out and like end this adventure because people are too challenged. And so to me, that just speaks to like how much people actually are in need of a sense of struggle. And especially when they can show up for other people in a way that it's like, okay, everyone's depending on me overcoming my little issue here and not letting it affect me. And so we can, one of the things that Younger talked about is this idea that soldiers don't get PTSD because of the trauma they experience in the field. They get PTSD because of the disconnection they experience when they come back. And we've seen like a small shadow of this in our work because we're not out there for 18 months together, right? We're out there for a week. But a lot of people experience a lot of grief in the weeks after an event because they realize that they don't have a lot of these things that made that moment feel so meaningful in their day-to-day life. So I think that to overcome the meaning crisis, we need to recognize that more comfort, more pleasure, more freedom isn't going to get us there. That actually we need positive struggle. And we need positive struggle that brings us into connection with the things that have given a sense of meaning to a human being, to a living being for throughout our history. And those fundamentally are knowing yourself, right? Knowing how to integrate and coordinate and utilize and be capable within all of the aspects of the self. Those are physical, cognitive, and emotional, right? And then how does that body mind interact with the physical world? And you can kind of think of the rest of the world as a landscape that you move through. How well can you move through that landscape? What are your relationships? What is afforded to you? And what are your opportunities within the landscape? And then there's the aspects of the landscape that are tools for you that can be manipulated. What is afforded to you in relationship to those, And then there's the aspect of the landscape, which is other agents. How well do you relate to other living agents? And then there's something like hyper agents, right? So you can be in a relationship to another person in a team, but then there's also the spirit of the whole team, right? Like when we're out there in the canyon, like you might not want to let down your girlfriend who's there, right? But you also don't want to let down the whole group. And you can feel that there's a kind of energy of the group. And are you contributing to bring that energy to a positive place or a negative place? And can you orient your energy to that effectively? And I think that scales up, right? I don't know how high it scales up. I follow John in being like a non-reductive physicalist, right? I don't think I don't believe in the two worlds mythology, but I think that the reality of principles and of higher order intelligences within this physical realm is actually undeniable. And I don't know how high it scales, right? Google is a force that we have to live in relationship to that massively affects our world all the time and whose moods we don't understand. Like I work, I work in social media, right? It's like, what is the algorithm doing this week? Do the designers of the algorithm even know? Not really.
That's
So
a good, I
those
mean,
are,
sorry, that's just kind of circled back just to because that was something, I mean, the point of that we're built essentially to struggle with other people, and that's a kind of optimal position to actually be in is so contrary to the, what you've brought up there, which is the technological aspect. I was watching a recent talk on AI with Elon Musk and Max Tegman and the guy, the Israeli Prime Minister guy, Benjamin Netanyahu or whatever. But they were discussing the that the positive outcome of AI is essentially heaven on earth. And they were having a kind of low key philosophical debate about what heaven on earth would look like. And it was just like, okay, no scarcity of resources, everyone has everything they need. And just in my head the whole time, I was just thinking, like, no, we've actually been trying to do that. And that doesn't actually work. There's a lack of self knowledge there about human beings, which is that if we don't have goals, if we don't have obstacles, if we don't have the journey, if we aren't sharing it with other people, we go insane and we break down. And we will create obstacles and chaos in order to have something to do, I think. So
that's
it's
Dostoevsky
interesting
quote, right?
the divergence between this kind of efficiency culture that's happening in tech that's trying to make things streamline everything, make it easier. And then I suppose this other ecologies of practice route that's, I think it was Kierkegaard that said something like, there'll come a point where the most virtuous thing you can do is make life harder for people instead
Yeah.
of just making it easier all the time. Because like, once it gets so easy, people are just their character will fall apart and it won't be good for them. And I think we're very much hitting that point in our society because most of our environment is technological as well. I mean, that's the other big problem is we live in a virtual world a lot of the time.
You know, in the Matrix, they said that 1999 was the peak technological experience for human beings. And I actually think that might have been true. Like, like I'm obviously I'm a beneficiary of the technologies that have come afterwards. The fact that we're the podcast world, the audiobooks world has been incredibly beneficial to me in my self-education process. And I've been able to make connections with John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson and all these people because of the internet. And like, I'm really not sure that my life would have been like some of the great things about my life were afforded to me by this technology. So I'm not sure my life would have been fundamentally less good if we had just stayed at the levels of 1999 technology. And there's a lot of things about the world that look to me dramatically worse, right? The political atmosphere is much worse. And we see this in the mental health of young people in particular. It's dramatically worse. And a lot of that, I think, is actually technological. There's other contributing factors. I'm not saying this is monocausal, but I think social media and smartphones have been very unhealthy for everybody, particularly the young people. So yeah, there's and I suppose you could say that what we do is give people virtuous hardship. Right. That's what people pay us a lot of money for, is to experience an extremely virtuous hardship. And we need it. It's funny because people will say, hey, everyone used to run around in the woods. Everyone used to rough and tumble play. So why would you pay for it? The truth is that people don't do it anymore. And the interesting thing, I think, is that when you sort of see a culture sort of going in a specific direction, it can create these back eddies that are the opposite. And then they can become really interesting places where something develops that's much more sophisticated and sees much more deeply, right? So if so basically parkour is exploratory locomotor play, right? Every animal does it, every child does it, given the opportunity. But never before have we sort of taken it out of its sort of implicit context and said, what is this thing if we actually try to grow it, if we actually try to use it as a tool for self-cultivation? And there's any number of things that we do all the time that turn out to be incredibly sophisticated if we pay deep attention to them. Something as simple as breath, right? Like how many mindfulness traditions around the world, how many people have had extraordinary experiences through the breath, right? You can't not breathe. And yet it's very worth your time to work with a teacher who can take you deeply, deeply into understanding how you impact yourself through breath. And so we've discovered that exploratory locomotor play is actually incredibly foundational to self-development. And if we recognize it in that way and we build an ecology of practices around it, it turns out to be really powerful.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's something that I've really experienced through martial arts myself, because I always felt like I had like two educations. I mean, I'm doing a PhD at the moment, so I've gone through like primary, secondary, college, master's, PhD, and
Yeah.
I don't think I've had as much development as I did through martial arts or through boxing. And
Mhm.
it's probably not even close. The characterological development in there is so much is so just completely divergent from what you're taught in most kind of bureaucratic education systems. And so in my mind, I've had these kind of two trainings essentially through a lifetime of martial arts and through the normal education system, which is great because my dad ran a martial arts gym in Dublin. He's a fifth dan black belt. He got me into it when I was like 2 years old. I know you talk about rough and tumble play. Like we used to just fight each other constantly. That was like, as soon as he walked into a room, that was it. We were scrapping and he'd be throwing me around and like, it was something I took for granted, I suppose.
Mhm.
But then to see the lack of that, and I train people in martial arts as well. So we get a lot of young men that are in their early 20s. They've been watching UFC or something, and they want to kind of get into martial arts. They want to do it. You know, maybe they're scared, they're nervous, or they're uncoordinated, and you can just see over the years how they change, how it becomes part of their physicality and the way they stand and the way they act and the self confidence that comes from it, the discipline. But even with martial arts, I feel there's a limit with, because a lot of it is aimed at fighting. I mean, there seems to be something very interesting about evolved move play that you're aiming it more at meaning and wisdom and self transcendence. Um,
Yeah.
how did you make that kind of move? I mean, do you feel that do you see results? I know I'm sure you do at this point, but I'm interested in how you see the difference, I suppose, between those.
Well, I think the martial arts are interesting because the idea of the martial arts as self-cultivation practices is very old. That's, you know, martial arts as character development is like how every karate school in the 80s sold itself to parents, right? You come here to learn discipline. You come here to learn character. Um, and, we can go back further and, look at the history of boxing and wrestling and how that was conceptualized as part of, a virtuous education in the 18th century, 19th century. You can see that Qigong and various martial arts were really deeply entwined with Taoist and Buddhist self-cultivation practices. In China, um, sumo arises from Shinto, right? It was a practice that was done at Shinto temples. There is this deep intertwining of it. The issue that I see with martial arts is that over time, there's been the level of violence in society has decreased to the point where it's very easy to practice martial arts and have no experience of the violence. And because of that, it's very easy for martial arts to actually become disconnected from the very thing that they're actually trying to teach you about. And and I think because capacity for violence is also really intertwined in male dominance hierarchies and male fantasy, like it's very easy for it to get captured into this sort of cult-like dynamic and these exaggerated stories, which really are actually taking people into bullshit. They're taking people into illusion. The thing that's really profound about parkour is that you can go do it. You can go do a jump where you would die if you fail, right? There's no moral hazard to it, right? Or there's very little moral hazard. If I want to go out and pick fights with people on the street to see how competent I am and to experience what what real violence is like, um, inherently to have a challenge that is really developmental for me, I have to take a lot of risk, a right? Like in parkour, I can do a challenge that's really, really psychologically challenging for me, that I can be 100% sure that I'm going to be successful every time. But if I'm 100% sure that I'm going to win a fight every time, I'm a bully, right? So I'm going out and hurting people to try to demonstrate my mastery. So that's it. That's a huge moral hazard. And then the way that that's been kind of solved in the martial arts has been through sport fighting. But every form of sport fighting misses large parts of the reality of what violence is outside of sport fighting. And because of the culture of sports and the prestige around sports, a lot of the rest of the martial art gets sacrificed. So you kind of had a bifurcation between what I think of as the Do martial arts, the martial arts that pursue the idea of cultivation of martial skill as a way towards self-development, and the Jitsu martial arts, the martial arts that are conceived primarily as a set of techniques that allow you to win really in a specific context, you know? So something like Tai Chi is a Do martial art, Aikido, whereas something like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is primarily not. And somewhere in between is something that actually is a truly great characterological tool. But
Yeah.
either of the current main two ways that we navigate through the martial arts has these really big problems, right? You've seen it and I've seen it and I've experienced it, right? I had a very interesting upbringing where I experienced some extraordinarily idyllic and beautiful things. And then I also had some pretty traumatic stuff that went on. And in particular, because I had learning disabilities, and so my parents' marriage was at a really difficult place in my early childhood years, like school years, first grade, second grade. Started getting in a lot of fights, pretty bad, right? Like, and so I was put in the martial arts, and I learned to control myself and have discipline and stop fighting. I didn't need to prove myself anymore by beating kids up in the schoolyard, because I was able to go spar in my Tang Soo Do school. I was able to know something about myself, and I was able to have someone who I aspired to be like, my martial arts teacher, who told me it's not okay to go do this outside unless you absolutely have to. But if we look at the best combat sport athletes in the world, the reality is they're not exemplars of character.
No, thinking of Conor McGregor, he's started out all right, but
Yeah, Connor's an interesting figure, right? Like Connor's coach, John Kavanagh, he's a black belt under the coach I started jiu-jitsu, not directly under, but I started under one of his black belts, and I'm a huge fan of his, Matt Thornton. He's been a huge inspiration to me. And when I look back at Connor's interviews in 2014, 2015, 2016, I see a human being with very high potential, someone who's thoughtful, someone who's highly intelligent, someone who's thinking in a very pro-social way. Why does he want to become famous? Why does he want to become successful? To take care of the people around him. And somehow he got trapped in this persona that he created to sell fights. And his demons sort of took over, and everything now is about status, right? He doesn't talk about taking care of the people around him. He talks about how he's the richest, he's the best, he's going to be a billionaire. He's going to do all these things. And now he punches old men in the pub.
Yeah, I actually started out training with them in the same boxing club as him, in Crumlin Boxing Club, with Phil Sutcliffe. Whenever I was 8, I started in there. And so, like, because again, Phil's club is very much like he's keeping a lot of troubled kids out of trouble. He's given them a purpose, a place to go. He's tough on them. He doesn't, take any shit. And there is that aspect of it. But then I suppose, because the professional fighting aspect, if you're going to be a professional fighter, okay, that's your life. You have to train, you have to fight. The fighting, in some sense, is the truth test. When you go into the ring, you find out everything you've done, you find out everything you haven't done. But for people then who are in dojos, I suppose the phenomena of McDojos and this idea of you go in and you learn a bunch of stuff that's completely not fit for purpose. You get into a real fight, you get beaten up. You've just been tricked, essentially. So needing that kind of in between where you can practice the path of the martial artist, face real violence and real challenge, but then also have the self-improvement aspect of it, to have that built into it as well. But it's a hard line to walk, I think, and it is. You do need a coach that's capable of doing that themselves. And a lot of the times, I think gyms either fall on either side of that division, depending on
Yeah.
who's in
And
charge, really.
like, you know, Matt has said that he believes Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Matt Thornton has said Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has far greater potential for character development than
Mm.
Tai Chi. And I agree with him, but I don't think that there are very many Jiu-Jitsu schools that are putting any energy into the pedagogical thought of how does that actually occur. You can observe that many troubled young men come in and become less troubled. But,
Mm.
you know, I would say John Jones is the greatest MMA fighter of all time. And I think he's one of the worst human beings that we've ever seen peak a sport. And that's common enough, right? Like obviously the world doesn't work in such a way that virtue and physical ability is going to be perfectly aligned with virtue in other areas. And when money gets involved in all these things, it's like obviously we're going to end up with some people at the top who we wouldn't necessarily want based on their character. But I think that my reading of it is that MMA has so many people at the top that are actually pretty profoundly morally insufficient, that it actually indicates a pipeline problem. That somewhere along the lines, that capacity of the martial arts to provide positive transformation is actually getting sacrificed, is actually getting lost, and another dynamic is taking over, which is corrupting human beings. And I think a lot of that has to do with fame and the structure of MMA and boxing as promotional events. But as martial artists, you know, like this is something John said that really struck me. He said, like, if you're going to train people in violence and if you're not training them in wisdom, then it's irresponsible, right? It's as if we're teaching people to fire handguns and not teaching them anything about handgun safety, right? So I think that it's something that martial arts teachers really need to grapple with at this stage. So but to go back to your original question, how has Evolved Move Play done it differently? I think that there's a few, and how did they come about? I think there's something, like I said, really unique about parkour, which is that I think it's easier for the Do and the Jitsu to be aligned in parkour because it just doesn't have some of those corrupting factors that 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 uh, that martial arts has. And the interesting thing is, like, if you look at something like the study of fear, the experience of fear, um, once you've been hit in the face and you're like actually sparring, you don't really have a lot of time to feel afraid. You're kind of in action and reactive, right? You might get pinned down and might get hit and might go through like a really intense like rise up of fear. There's something different in the way that it has to be processed. And I think there's something really valuable about like, okay, go through the Shark Tank experience in jiu-jitsu, get overwhelmed, get scared, fight through it, right? But there's something really interesting about walking up to a jump, right? To me, it's like the closest thing in martial arts would be walking into the ring.
Yeah, literally squaring off as the same kind of,
squaring off,
the jump.
deciding that you're going to fight. But imagine that you could do that like 50 times in a session. Like feel that level of okay, and know your process for overcoming it. That I think is what makes parkour really a uniquely powerful place to start the study of your own response to challenge. And I think that taking parkour and integrating it into martial arts, integrating it into team sport, integrating it into dance, integrating it into literally like storytelling, theater.
Hmm.
When all those things start to integrate, you have this capacity to see the metagame of life, that all of these things are actually in service to more profoundly. The analogy that's popping into my head is we have five senses, right? Because it's very easy for us to get a false signal from any one sense, and the other senses act as another form of verification. And so you can imagine that we're like focusing in these different lenses on problem. And by focusing those lenses and having access to different lenses, we have a more accurate picture, right? So if you imagine that parkour and martial arts and dance and, um, you know, weightlifting, they're all in relationship. They're all a local game, but they all reveal something about a meta. And you can fall in love with the local game's kind of pathway into the metagame on some level and say, hey, we're seeking this and this is profound and this is something beyond it. But you're only able to see so much through that game. It's kind of like the blind man and the elephant. But if you
Yeah,
take
you
on
just
these
get a little
different practices,
piece.
now you're saying, hey, I'm going in and experiencing what it's like to touch the tusk and what it's like to touch the leg and what it's like to touch the undercarriage and what it's like to touch the ear. And now I have a much more clear picture. Ah, it's an elephant,
Yes.
right?
Okay.
And so I think that's what's a good way of thinking about what's so profound about taking on an ecology of practices and why those
Yeah.
relationships that I laid out are so fundamental to recognizing what's going to bring us into a deep experience of meaning in life.
Yes, that because the idea of the kind of counterpoises. I mean, my ecology of practices that I worked out is the martial arts, but then I also write stage plays and short stories, and have written for over 10 years at this point, and also then studying philosophy, doing the dialogical kind of
Yeah.
practices. I've done John's Dialogos and circling course as well, and do some stuff around that. And I've started to see how through the counterposition of these different arts, I know John talks about the dialogical, imaginal, mindfulness, and embodiment kind of
Mhm.
model of the ecologies of practices. Through the counterpoise, I've got a more complete picture because I did feel the martial arts training super profound, but also there's stuff I got from writing that I couldn't get in martial arts. There's stuff I got from philosophy and from dialogue that I couldn't get in martial arts as well. So there, in some sense, there needs to be those bulwarks of the multiple opponent processes together to get that
Yeah.
better picture.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. The fundamental claim that one of the fundamental claims behind this model that I'm offering of the five relationships of practice is that those are actually the fundamental opponent processing relationships that we can have, right? So,
okay.
John talks about the dialogical self, right? You're, you're a system of opponent processing relationships, right? So the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, right? Your sympathetic is always trying to tell you, hey, be more anxious, more aroused, more ready to take on the world. Your parasympathetic is always trying to say, hey, we got to take some time to rest. We got to take some time to digest, right? There's no optimal end state because there's actually an environment that 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 opponent processing is trying to solve for. So over time, it changes. We think of homeostasis like there's this time we're trying to return to a baseline, but really, I like the term allostasis. The baseline is actually changing all the time because the optimal relationship to the environment is always changing. And if you read John's relevance realization papers, you see that the whole concept of relevance realization itself is set up off of these same unprocessing relationships, right? Exploit versus explore, for instance. So, like we can think about this in relationship to practice. Should you just keep doing your Bujinkan, or should you go try some boxing? Right? Should you just dance Lindy Hop, or should you go learn some contemporary? Would you become a better dancer if you just did some parkour? Right? Or maybe, and then beyond, like if dance is actually in service to your character, a lot of times the thing that you've spent all this time on is actually not even the best tool anymore for your self development. And so that's where we get into that explore thing, right? What is relevant? So we have one of those. So we have he has a bunch. I can't remember them all off the top of my head, but we're we're integrating all these layers of opponent processing at the level of the physical, right? Some part of you, like if you in any athletic movement, some of you is trying to be still and hold the structure, and some of you is trying to move off of that structure. So there's a stabilization and a dynamics aspect of athletic movement. So if you train yourself such that you become more and more stable, you can actually start getting getting rid of your ability to create muscle synergies. So we see this, people don't realize this, but we see this a lot with the kind of traditional weight training that's really popular, right? Everyone thinks that if you just squat heavier and deadlift heavier and bench press heavier, Like, it's just going to make you more athletic. And it works for most people going from like a novice to an intermediate level of strength. We see a rapid kind of fall off in the positive transfer, and we can actually start to see negative transfer. You can take an elite sprinter and make them slower by improving their deadlift and squat because you put too much effort into it, and you actually produce negative adaptations. We don't have to go into that. That's probably a little too deep. But so you need to be able to stabilize your core, and you also need to be able to disassociate your hip from your shoulder. Right? If you want to punch hard, a bench press and a squat that gets you always stacked and sagittal is not going to do the work for you. You have to be able to get the shoulder back and create stretch through the fascia to spring back and, load that hand for you. So what are the opponent processing the relationships within the self? And then the self is obviously in relationship to the environment. What are the relationships in the environment? That's the landscape, the tools, the other agents, and the, hyper agents. If you put yourself in relationship to those things, that's going to give you the best capacity to become adaptive to the world. One of the analogies we're working with a lot right now in our thinking is the analogy of attunement. So if you train martial arts all the time and you think about violence all the time, you think about what would happen if somebody ambushed you in a dark alley and, hey, you're going to rip out their eyes and grab their testicles, right? And you get yourself on this hair trigger of violence. And then your kid jumps at you, right? You got to defend yourself. Like they're going to land with their knee on your face, but you probably don't want to rip their eye out. That might not be good, and like soldiers, there's a real problem for soldiers coming back, right? They're on a hair trigger. They're in an environment where someone, they need to be amped up, but it can be really dangerous for the people around them when they can't adjust to the environment. So how do we train people to have a more adaptive capacity, to be better attuned, right? To recognize the difference between playing, black metal versus classical music. And so we can do that across all these axes. So that's how I think about it, as just like you're literally, I think that parasympathetic versus sympathetic, there's an appropriate attunement of the parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system that resonates with the environment that you're in. If you're hanging out with a bunch of friends and everybody's relaxed and having a good time and one person's super anxious, it kills the vibe. Right? That sounds super wooey or slang, but literally like you're sending signals out to each other all the time through the tone of your voice, through your physical posture, etc. And if someone's signals are not in alignment with the rest of the signals of the group, it disrupts the psychological container that the group is at that point. And it is very much like having somebody who's singing off key or out of rhythm in a chorus. And so I think it's just such a beautiful way of really getting a felt sense of what we're aiming at, right? Can you train yourself such that you can fall into that resonance, right, appropriately, so that you can play melody off it, so you can play harmony off it?
Like that's so, I mean, it's crazy that it's something that's coming up for me there is that that's what philosophy used to be about. I was thinking of Seneca and like the harmony of nature within and without, coming into the flow of nature flowing, and this idea of a kind of continuous sense of joy and peace of mind from always being, capable of getting yourself into the right position for the moment and the time. And I kind of, what was coming up in my mind was that are virtues tracking that kind of middle way in a sense? Because you have the opponent processing all of the time, and we have our ability to find the appropriate mean, which is a virtue really. And how capable we are of that is really our character in a sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, so I think Aristotle would have said that like courage and cowardice exist on a continuum, and that the ends of the continuum are pathological, right? And I see courage as a higher order value than that. It's not the same as fearlessness. So
Mhm.
fearfulness and fearlessness, you could see as a continuum where
Mhm.
there's an appropriate middle ground, and that appropriate middle ground is shifting in relationship to the environment. But
Mm.
courage to me is the capacity to act in the face of fear. And I don't actually think that that can become excessive.
Mm.
Right?
Yeah, I mean,
Think
I
about
suppose the
hierarchical
excess
virtue.
of courage is recklessness. So in the sense of always, anytime you feel fear, charging into a situation, maybe, or constantly being over the top about trying to do dangerous things to appear fearless when actually you're kind
Yeah.
of controlled by fear. Um,
Yeah. So fearlessness is not a virtue, right? Recklessness is not a virtue.
um,
But the capacity to overcome fear when it arises,
um,
I don't think there's ever a negative to that. So I think there's parts of virtues that are these spectrums where we're looking for that golden mean. And then there's higher order
mm,
virtues that they're like the platonic essence of virtue or something where there's it's we can only move towards it, right?
mhm,
Um one way to think about this is I think that if we want to love someone well, we have to we actually have to offer something that is between care and discipline, something between care and boundaries, right? So, like if you think about a child needs you to make sure its needs are met, right? So the child is hungry, you feed the child falls down and is bruised, and you pick it up and comfort the child, and you give the child a Band-Aid, right? In case of the boo-boo. But it also has a need for discipline. It also has a child also has a need for encouragement. So you can say to a child, you can do this thing that you're afraid to do. And you need to push through it, right? Or you can do this thing that you just don't want to do. It's necessary for your development and growth. If you give a child nurture without discipline and encouragement, um, it creates weakness. It creates dependency. On the flip side, if you create a child discipline without love, right, it creates hardness, right? It creates a inability to connect, a lack of sensitivity. So we can take that same thing and say, maybe those are contingent, those are variables, those are ends of the spectrum in how you should treat yourself, or as a teacher, how you should treat a student. Right? So I noticed at some point that the times that I felt I was most disciplined in my life inevitably resulted in burnout and injury. So I was like, well, I need to know how not to
mm.
end up all the way over there. But then I would cycle between extreme discipline and then excessive self-indulgence, right? There's like, well,
It's like the
clearly,
Buddha,
yeah,
the one extreme
the
to the
Buddha,
other.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So you clearly like just, not eating enough calories and only eating, protein and broccoli and uh, white rice and or brown rice and then training 4 hours a day is not working for me. So, okay, now it's time to play video games and eat ice cream. It's like, well, that's not helping me either. So what I realized is that you have uh, there's a shadow side to caring, which is indulgence. Right? You give the child sweets every day because the child smiles and is happy when you give them sweets, even though down the road they're less happy because now they're emotionally dysregulated, and you can see that, but you do it anyways because you need that emotional feedback of their positive regard when they get a little piece of candy. On the flip side is that discipline can can uh, can revert to abuse. We don't use physical punishment with our children at all, and I don't think that it is the case that it is always wrong to use physical discipline with children necessarily, but what I do think is that I think that adults don't necessarily take seriously enough how much of a temptation stepping into that is. Right? I experienced this with training dogs, right? When I was younger, right? I was taught a really harsh method of training dogs. And there was a point where other things in my life came out, and I went too far with one of the dogs that I was working with. I really regretted it afterwards. And I realized that, like, as soon as you give yourself the freedom to use physical force to negatively condition an animal, you always have a pathway for your anger to express out. And that's a very dangerous thing to give yourself access to. So that's, why we make that choice, is that it's like, it's not that the tool couldn't possibly improve a child's life, and maybe children who are in much more difficult circumstances need someone who can use that tool effectively. But I don't want to take on the risk in myself of giving myself that potential moral hazard. And in the same way, right, you can wake up in the morning and go for a run because it's what you've committed to, or you can go for a run because there's some pain inside you that is going to be hidden by inflicting more pain on yourself. And so you have to recognize that what looks like discipline can be abuse, or you might not even know the difference.
Hmm.
And so what's motivating it? What's the intention? So there's a dark side. So we want to be moving from abuse and indulgence to care, right? So like, if I'm tired and worn out and I sit down and just scroll my Instagram feed, right? That's indulgence to me. Like, it's not really doing the thing. It's not really filling the bucket that I need fed. If I actually just go and take a nap when I'm tired, that's actually like a higher expression of care for myself. And as I've been able to move from more reliance on something like my feed to more reliance on something like sleep, it's really improved my life. So the shadow is abuse and indulgence. The higher expression is discipline and care. But there's still a golden mean. You can still over discipline yourself. You can still have excess. But I would say that the highest order is actually agapic love, right? That what guides you in that choice is a deep desire to bring the good into being in relationship to yourself, in relationship to a child, in relationship to a student. And then you cannot possibly want to bring the good into being too much. So for me, agape, like courage, is a higher order virtue. There's no golden mean. There's no excess. There's you only want to become more capable of expressing agape in the world.
Yeah, and I'm thinking almost that I had John Vervaeke's where, there's no panacea practice in a sense, but there's no, you always have that dramatic tension of opposites and going too far and not going far enough and learning where that mean is as you progress, but that requires attention to one's error correction. I know Vervaeke talks about it like a mindset of optimizing rather than maximizing. Instead of trying to maximize your discipline or maximize your indulgence, you're trying to optimize between them for what is necessary for the time. But that's almost like a way of life that you have to commit yourself to, in a sense. It's very easy to just unconsciously go through the motions, be very reactive to what's going on, not particularly well defined. And so there does seem to be a pedagogical challenge there. Do you think that's something that Evolve, Move, Play, that like optimizing mindset of which is a kind of love, I think, in a way, it's love of the truth and bringing the good into being that, is what you exert the moral effort for to attend to that. And is that something you've built into it in a way is that working?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, so if you do parkour, you have to have a relationship with truth, right? Because you can do a jump or you cannot do a jump. And love is ultimately what keeps you in something, right? You love this jump because something about it is beautiful. So there's intrinsic in the practice, there's this relationship with the good, the true, and the beautiful. And we can see that across all these different practices. And by looking at them through these different lenses, we can we have to make there's this step that has to be made, which is that eventually just have to recognize that what you're doing isn't in service of the local game. Right.
It's the higher game.
If you go to the gym today to practice boxing, how much do you feel like you're ever going to have to utilize those skills in a direct, practical way?
In Dublin, sometimes fairly regularly. It's
Okay,
more than I would like, but
Yeah,
no, I mean, there's other goals, I suppose, fitness, health, just
I
feeling
live in a
good.
town. Oh, so like I don't go to bars, right?
Yeah,
I don't drink.
Yep.
I'm 40 years old. I'm 41 years old. I've got kids. I live in a small suburban cul-de-sac. Like the likelihood that anyone is going to assault me is vanishingly low. Right. And it could happen, right? It could happen, but spending my life preparing for it, it's very unreasonable, right?
Yeah.
So I always joke, you know, what cracks me up is you go to a self-defense seminar and you see these guys super, they're super serious about like how you have to be super pragmatic about what would happen if someone assaults you in a dark alley and how, you don't get to choose the bad things that happen to you. It's like, sure. And then they walk outside and they start smoking cigarettes. Like, well, maybe you are choosing the likelihood that you're gonna be assaulted versus the likelihood you're gonna get cancer is actually like, like I always joke that like the primary self-defense skills that we need in life are the skill to not drink and drive, the skill to not text and drive, the skill to push our plate away, right? These are actually the primary self-defense skills.
Primary killers, really. Heart disease, isn't it?
Heart disease,
the big
cancer.
opponent. Diabetes.
Car accidents kill way more people than assaults and murders do. Situational awareness. Where are drunk drivers? So I think there's a point where if someone really thinks deeply about their practice of martial arts, if you're not 25 years old and you're not out at bars and you're not like engaging with this type of thing, there's a point where you got to be like, if I want to keep doing this, I got to find another reason to do it. Right. When I was in my mid-20s, I worked as a nightclub security. I was physically picking people up and throwing them out of bars. I had high relevance to my martial arts practice because I chose to put myself in a situation where it was highly relevant because I wanted, right? I didn't have to work nightclub security. But I'd spent 15 years becoming a martial artist and nobody was picking fights with me. So I needed to go find a place where they would. But I'd still find it fun to pick people up and throw them out of bars, if I'm honest. But I just
still do it.
don't.
There's another a backup career in case things go south.
But I don't want to be up till 4 a.m. and
it's too late
in that environment. I hate house music. It's terrible.
And drunk people.
And drunk people. Yeah. Not my scene. So it's like if I want to continue the martial arts, I have to see them as in service of something else. And then that's when we begin to see the meta. And what are the dimensions of the metagame in some sense? It's like coming into true relationship with the good, the true.
Oh man, that's quite a place to, I feel like we'll have to talk again, Rafe. Unfortunately we've run out of time, I know, but the metagame, that's something I will be pondering now. And for people who are interested in Evolve Move Play, I'm going to put all the details in the description. Where's the best place for them to go if they're looking for workshops and stuff? Where would you like them to check it out?
Yeah. EvolveMovePlay.com. We've got retreats, workshops, and online courses available for people. We just debuted, I think, 6 workshops coming out for next year. We just started our schedule for next year. So we've got stuff coming up on the West Coast, the States, stuff in the East Coast, central of the country, and a couple in Europe as well. So people from all over can find us. And, as those fill up, we can start looking at other spots. I know we've got some interest in Ireland. We'd love to come to Ireland.
Oh man, if you come to Ireland, I'll bring a crowd. I'll bring all the dodgy Dubliners will come down. I think that'd be great. There's a lot of interest in that type of thing here for sure.
That'd be cool. Cool. Well, yeah. So then, yeah, and then we have online workshops. So if people want to get our online courses. So if people want to get started right away, we have these courses that integrate aspects of daily movement practices with parkour progression and mindfulness practices and journaling. And all of that is done, starting with stuff that you can do in your own home and then working up to seeing the environment for what it affords you and finding the places in your environment that you can swing and jump and climb and move in trees and on rocks and, urban environments as well. So if people are interested in that, that's where you find it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rafe. And all of the links will be in the description as well. So thanks for tuning in.